Introduction. Every year at Halloween we see memes and articles alleging its pagan origin in Samhain, supposedly an ancient Celtic festival. Various sources, from the venerable Time magazine to the less respectable History Channel, assure us Halloween was one of many pagan traditions which the Catholic Church appropriated. However, this simply isn't true. Was Samhain a pagan festival of the dead? No, it wasn't. Nicholas Rogers, historian of York University, writes, quote, "The notion that Samhain was a festival of the dead was first popularised by Sir James Fraser." End quote. Fraser wrote in the late 19th century and had a huge influence on the history of folklore. However, virtually all of Fraser's work has long been discredited by historians and is no longer considered reliable. Jacob Bender, professor of English literature at Middlesex College, notes that the idea that Samhain was a festival of the dead appears to have been, quote, first popularised in 1786 thanks to the sloppy anthropology work of Charles Vallancey, end quote, whose claim, quote, has since been repeatedly debunked, end quote. Rogers likewise writes, quote, there is no hard evidence that Samhain was ever specifically devoted to the dead or ancestor worship, end quote. So what were the traditional Samhain activities? Ronald Hutton, one of the foremost historians of pre-Christian British folklore, says simply, quote, we have virtually no idea because Northern European pagans were illiterate and no record remains of their ceremonies, end quote. Significantly, there is no evidence of Samhain among the writings of the early Celtic Christians. Robert Davis, historian at Ohio State University, notes that a very early Christian Celtic calendar from the 2nd century does not mention Samhain at all, suggesting strongly that the festival either did not exist at this time or was simply ignored by Christians. In fact, the earliest record we have for Samhain dates to the 10th century, a couple of hundred years after the Christian festival of All Hallows' Eve, later called Halloween, was already well established. This Celtic record, the Ulster cycle, translates Samhain as summer end and only mentions the festivities involving feasting and sporting events. There is no mention of death, ghosts, or the supernatural. It's just a kind of end-of-season festival. Halloween was not appropriated by Christians from pagans. Beth Barr, historian of Baylor University, writes that, quote, festivals commemorating saints, All Hallows' Eve, existed in Europe by 800, end quote, adding, quote, these festivals were not created to supplant previously existing pagan rituals, end quote. The name All Hallows' Eve was eventually contracted to Halloween. Barr also explains that originally this festival was celebrated at different times in different countries in a way which shows it very obviously wasn't replacing a pagan Celtic festival. German Christians celebrated it on November 1st, but certainly not to replace Samhain, which they didn't even know about. And if the Celtic Christians themselves were trying to replace Samhain, they would have held their Halloween festival at the end of October or on November 1st. Instead, they held it in April. Although attempts have been made to link Halloween to the pagan Roman festivals Lemuralia and Pomona, Rogers observes, quote, Lemuralia occurred in May, not October, end quote, adding that the festival Pomona, quote, does not appear to have ever actually existed, end quote. But aren't Halloween practices pagan? No. In fact, all of them developed in the Christian era well after the 9th century. Rogers writes that the original Celtic celebration of Samhain, quote, did not offer much in the way of actual ritual practices, end quote, adding that most Halloween practices, quote, developed in conjunction with the medieval holy days of All Souls and All Saints' Day, end quote. In his 2001 book Stations of the Sun, A History of the Ritual Year in Britain, Hutton describes the rituals belonging to what he calls, quote, the modern Halloween, end quote. He covers a very wide range of practices which are now common at Halloween, including various forms of trick-or-treating, the carving of vegetables such as turnips, the eating of certain food, and various songs. It is clear from Hutton's research that these practices differed widely throughout England, Ireland, and Wales, with various regions of England in particular having their own specific activities, and that none of them date any earlier than the 17th century. They are neither preservations or revivals of original pagan practices.